We're diving into a seismic economic shift where America's top official says chasing cheap goods is no longer the essence of the American dream. So our mission today really is to unpack a pretty substantial stack of sources we've got here.
Yeah, and they all seem to detail this really high-stakes economic gamble.
They do. We're looking at a very aggressive policy platform, dominated by these sweeping tariffs, protectionist measures.
And it's all designed to hit this massive long-term goal of national prosperity.
Exactly. Even though, and this is the key, nearly every external forecast is warning of, well, immediate pain and turbulence. This isn't just a small policy tweak.
No, not at all. It's a fundamental redefinition of what economic success even means for the U.S.
And the scale of this shift is it's staggering.
It really is. We saw one estimate in our sources that detailed the impact of these tariffs, and it focused specifically on California.
Which is always a good bellwether for imported goods.
Right. And the average tariff rate there has, well, it's skyrocketed from just 2.4% to an estimated 27% as of mid-April.
27%. I mean, that is not a marginal increase.
No, it's a sea change. It completely changes the cost structure of goods flowing into the country, and, that immediately creates a conflict with what consumers expect to pay.
That huge cost increase is exactly why the mainstream economic models are sounding the alarm.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these forecasts are anticipating something they're calling stagflation lite.
Which is a tricky environment.
Mm-hmm.
The economy isn't technically shrinking, but GDP growth is running persistently below the typical 2% trend.
And at the same time, core inflation stays stubbornly above 3% well into 2026. So for you listening, that means an economy that just feels stagnant and expensive.
And to get even more specific than that, our sources suggest the U.S. is projected to experience a full-blown growth recession.
Okay, let's define that because it sounds like a contradiction.
It does. A growth recession isn't a technical recession where GDP actually declines. It's when growth is, technically positive, but it's too slow to keep pace with the population and workforce expansion.
Which leads directly to rising unemployment.
It does. And that's the consensus forecast for the immediate future.
So that's the turbulence we have to grapple with. But here's the critical pivot, the administration's defense.
Yeah, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is really pushing back hard on all this negativity.
He is. He's arguing that these forecasts just misunderstand the strategic goal. He's defining the new economic priority not as, maximizing consumer savings.
A goal he basically calls outdated.
Exactly. But as achieving national prosperity and ensuring economic security. He's framing these price increases as, and this is his phrase, a one-time price adjustment.
A necessary evil. Essentially.
Right. Necessary short-term turbulence required to unlock what he calls a substantial acceleration starting in 2026. So to really get this, we have to start with that core philosophical foundation.
It's a foundational reset. The administration's argument is that for decades, trade deals have prioritized getting the lowest possible price for imported goods.
Which on the surface sounds good for consumers.
It does. And it benefited shareholders and maybe the wealthiest consumers. But it often came at the cost of the domestic manufacturing base and working-class job security. This new strategy is a direct break from that.
So if it's not cheap goods from abroad, tell us what Bessent thinks the American dream is.
He was very specific on this. He asserted quite directly that, and I'm quoting here, access to cheap goods is not the essence of the American dream.
Wow, okay.
The true goal, he argues, is the concept that any citizen can achieve prosperity, upward mobility, and economic security. He says previous trade deals just overlook that.
So this whole strategy is an instrument of national economic security designed to rebuild that prosperity at home, no matter the short-term cost of imports.
That's the idea.
Okay, that's the big picture. But we have to connect that philosophy to the reality on the ground. If tariffs are hitting 27% at major ports, that pressure is real, especially for middle-income Americans.
And the source material is very clear on this point. The tariffs are not being absorbed by foreign producers.
So they're just being passed on.
They're largely anticipated to be passed on to consumers.
And that's the core of the immediate problem.
It is. You're talking about increased inflation on major categories. Things like new vehicles, clothing, electronics. They're all particularly vulnerable.
And this creates what economists call a K-shaped divergence.
Let's pause on that term because it really explains who is feeling the pain here.
Good idea.
So the K describes how different income groups move in totally different directions. The hard data shows the consumer base is, well, it's fragmenting. The top 10% of households are responsible for a near majority of consumer spending. They're pretty insulated from these price hikes. That's the upper arm of the K, moving up.
But the middle-income households?
They're the lower arm of the K, those between the 20th and 80th percentiles. The sources say they are projected to continue to feel the pinch of inflation most acutely.
Because these tariff costs are hitting the everyday goods they need. And if those middle-income families are feeling that pinch and they pull back on their spending, that has a direct and I assume negative effect on the job market.
It does. The sources link this policy uncertainty directly to employment risks. These tariffs and just the general volatility are broadly assumed to dampen job growth.
And not just in manufacturing, I take it.
No, across several major sectors. Trade, transportation, utilities, leisure and hospitality, even professional and business services. All sectors that really rely on confident consumers and predictable supply chains.
So if you're a consumer, you're looking at higher prices and less job security at the same time.
That's the forecast.
So you have this huge forecast of short-term, slower growth, rising unemployment, inflation hitting the middle class, all driven in part by the very tariffs meant to create long-term prosperity. How does the administration even begin to deal with that tension?
Well, they minimize the role of tariffs in the current inflation picture. They strategically redirect the blame.
How so?
When industry leaders warned that new tariffs would mean higher consumer prices, Bessent only conceded that tariffs could result in a one-time price adjustment.
A one-time adjustment. That's a very subtle but crucial distinction. It makes it sound like a quick fix.
It does. He's treating the impact as a static event, not an ongoing inflationary pressure.
So where does he place the blame for the persistent inflation we're actually seeing?
He argues it's inherited. He calls it embedded inflation from the Biden years. The argument is that the current inflation cycle is a structural problem from past spending, not recent trade decisions.
And here's where he uses some really interesting data to try and decouple the trade issue from the overall inflation problem.
Yes, precisely. He points out that imported goods inflation is actually quite low, around 1.8%.
Okay.
And he contrasts this with the overall PCE number, which is closer to 2.9%. The PCE is the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. It measures what people actually spend.
So he uses that comparison to argue.
He argues that the inflation we're seeing is actually being generated by the domestic service economy, which, and this is a direct quote, actually has nothing to do with tariffs.
But let's challenge that for a second. If the service economy is driving inflation, isn't that a problem for his core goal? You need strong domestic demand to keep service prices stable.
That's the key question hanging over the 2025 forecast.
If the tariffs pinch the middle class, wouldn't that eventually hurt the domestic demand you need to keep the service sector healthy?
The administration counters that by shifting the narrative. They say the current affordability problem isn't from their policies, but from the last administration creating scarcity, whether it was in energy or overregulation. They claim fixing that scarcity is the real solution.
Okay, so how are consumers actually doing right now, despite all these worries?
The Treasury's current assessment is, maybe surprisingly, positive. Bessent noted that the holiday shopping season has been very strong. Yes, seeing positive activity across all the income cohorts thus far. This suggests that those dire predictions of a sharp drop in consumer spending, the political comments about families only affording $2 instead of $30,
Right.
they were factually incorrect, at least in the immediate term. Consumers seem to be resilient.
And there are other specific signs they're pointing to, right? Something called the Common Man Index.
Yes, the Common Man Index is a targeted measure of the basket of goods that matter most for working Americans. We're talking food, gasoline, rent.
The things you really feel.
Exactly. And he notes that this index is now, for the first time, below the overall inflation index. That's a very positive data point for them. It suggests the basic necessities are starting to come down in price, which could be mitigating some of the pain from more expensive imported goods.
And this brings us squarely back to the long-term vision, the payoff. They're confident that these adjustments, plus other policies, are going to pay off dramatically. So let's transition from the turbulence to the projected acceleration. What are the specifics?
They are specifically forecasting a great year in 2026 and a substantial acceleration starting as early as the first and second quarters of that year.
And this isn't just wishful thinking. They have a model for it.
They do. They predict a definitive crossing of the curves.
Explain that visual for us. Crossing the curves.
It's the central image of their success story. Bessent expects the inflation curve bend down and the real income curve substantially accelerate.
And historically, when real income grows faster than inflation, that's when you actually feel richer. Your purchasing power genuinely increases.
Exactly. And the key is that the administration links this directly to non-tariff policies designed to boost disposable income.
What are these specific policy boosters they're counting on?
They're targeting policies that put more money directly into the pockets of working Americans. Things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security income.
Plus the deductibility of auto loans I saw.
Yes, these are all intended to be fast-acting mechanisms that create real purchasing power increases, completely separate from all the tariff friction. The combination of inflation receding and these tax cuts hitting paychecks is what they believe guarantees that 2026 acceleration.
And they have a name for this whole vision, this idea that the benefits won't just flow to the top.
They do. They call it parallel prosperity. The idea is that Main Street and Wall Street can both do great. It's a philosophy meant to end the perception that economic growth has to be a zero-sum game.
This whole gamble also seems to rely on a huge amount of long-term capital coming in from abroad.
Oh, absolutely. The sources noted the administration has secured global investment pledges of over $10 trillion in capital from abroad.
10 trillion, where is that money going?
That's a foundational part of the model. It's not just going into, abstract investments. It's being explicitly targeted toward infrastructure, reshoring domestic manufacturing, and creating new production capacity right here in the United States.
So that's the structural payoff of the trade war. It forces global capital to move into the U.S. economy.
Exactly, to bypass tariffs and secure their supply chains. But, and analysts note this is a critical time frame, it takes about 2 to 4 years for that kind of investment to fully show up in GDP growth.
Which lines up perfectly with the promised 2026 acceleration.
It's a calculated wait.
And on the trade side, these tariffs aren't meant to be permanent barriers, are they? They're negotiating leverage.
That's the argument. Bessent predicted that consumer prices will start to level off because new, favorable trade deals are being signed, particularly with Central and South American countries.
So they can remove tariffs on specific goods.
Right. Things like coffee, cocoa, and bananas. So you apply pressure on your major rivals while simultaneously offering targeted price relief on common goods through new partnerships.
And finally, let's spend a minute on what seems to be the most unique part of this strategy, the Trump accounts.
This is a major generationally focused initiative. It's about financial literacy and actual ownership. The program proposes giving every U.S. child born between 2025 and 2028 a $1,000 tax-deferred investment.
And it's not a savings bond. That distinction seems really important.
It's crucial. This is an investment in a widely diversified, low-cost index fund.
So why that specific mechanism? Why an index fund?
Because it makes every child literally a stakeholder in the American economic engine. An index fund grows with the market. The goal is to give every child a piece of the American economy from day one, coupled with financial literacy efforts in schools.
And over decades, that initial $1,000 could grow substantially.
It could give future generations a much better financial starting point. And the program isn't stopping with the federal contribution.
Right, they're looking for private support.
Exactly. They are asking philanthropists to top up these accounts. Our sources say some major philanthropic groups are already pledging capital to supplement these accounts, especially for children in economically challenged areas.
So it becomes a public-private partnership to bridge wealth gaps.
And promote universal financial education. It's a really long-term play.
Okay, let's try to unpack this enormous deep dive. We've seen this really clear tension in the sources. You've got the immediate forecast showing a difficult environment, a growth recession, and price hikes for the middle class.
All driven by tariffs and policy uncertainty.
But the administration views all that turbulence as just necessary short-term pain. That one-time price adjustment you mentioned.
Right. A price they have to pay to achieve this much broader long-term goal of national security and this genuine parallel economic prosperity.
Fueled by massive capital investment and targeted tax policy.
But if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, the entire success story really hinges on that 2026 acceleration actually happening.
And the sources kept coming back to one major risk.
They did. Federal policy uncertainty. It's repeatedly called the biggest downside risk to the current economic forecast.
Because it just makes it so difficult for businesses to plan long-term investments or for consumers to feel secure.
Exactly. So the administration's policies are intended to create long-term stability and security, this vision of parallel prosperity. How quickly does that policy uncertainty have to fade for the promised 2026 acceleration to become a reality? That speed of clarity. That feels like the measure by which this whole strategic gamble will ultimately be judged.